August 1964, the first F-4 Phantom touched down on Vietnamese soil, carrying 16 years of development and an $18 million price tag. It was the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Mach 2.23 top speed, 18,000 pounds of payload, world altitude records that seemed like science fiction. 3 months later, 67% of American air losses belonged to this same aircraft. Not because of enemy superiority, but because of a fundamental misunderstanding about how modern war would actually be fought. The generals had designed the perfect weapon for a conflict that never existed. The McDonnell F-4 Phantom arrived in Vietnam with impeccable credentials. Its J-79 engines generated 17,000 pounds of thrust each, more power than any enemy fighter. On paper, it was invincible. But between August and November 1964, 28 Phantoms were shot down in air-to-air combat, while North Vietnamese MiGs, supposedly obsolete fighters, lost only 7 aircraft. The problem wasn't the machine. It was the mission it had been designed for. McDonnell engineers had built a nuclear interceptor to shoot down Soviet bombers at 100 kilometers distance with radar-guided missiles. But in Vietnam, it faced agile fighters in close-range dogfights at less than 2 kilometers, where its AIM-7 Sparrow missiles had an 85% failure rate. Worse still, it had no internal cannon, leaving pilots defenseless when MiGs closed the distance. What followed was the most brutal transformation of a weapon of war in modern history, because the F-4 Phantom didn't just have to learn to fight in Vietnam. It had to completely reinvent itself, while its pilots died in the process. This is the story of an aircraft born for a war that never existed and survived a war it should never have fought. The obsession with speed had begun on October 14, 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. But by 1955, the Cold War demanded something more than speed records. It needed weapons. On May 26th of that year, 4 Navy officers met at the Pentagon with a specification that seemed impossible: a fighter capable of intercepting Soviet bombers 100 miles from aircraft carriers, carrying tactical nuclear weapons and flying at Mach 2 in sustained combat. McDonnell Aircraft, which had never built a successful supersonic fighter, promised to deliver it in less than 5 years. The design that emerged defied all conventions. 2 J-79 engines instead of 1. The internal cannon was eliminated to maximize space for fuel and missiles. Wings with cranked geometry angled 12 degrees upward to solve stability problems that had appeared in wind tunnel testing. But the riskiest bet was trusting completely in radar-guided missiles. 4 AIM-7 Sparrow semi-active missiles and 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles. Test pilots complained immediately. Without a cannon, we're defenseless when missiles fail. The engineers responded that the missiles would never fail. On May 27, 1958, the first XF-4H-1 took off from Lambert Field with test pilot Robert Little at the controls. In the first 18 months of flight, the prototype suffered landing gear failures, air intake problems, and a disturbing tendency to enter stalls without warning at high speeds. But when it worked, it was devastating. On December 6, 1959, the second prototype reached Mach 2.5 and 98,557 feet altitude in an almost vertical climb that broke 16 world records in a single mission. The Navy had found its ultimate weapon. In 1960, the F-4 Phantom II officially entered service with specifications that left behind any existing fighter. 41,000 feet per minute climb rate, 18,650 pounds of payload, a combat range of 900 nautical miles. It was a perfect nuclear interceptor for World War III that never came. But on August 1964, when the first Phantoms landed at air bases in Vietnam, they faced a type of war they were never designed for. And what happened in the following 3 months would forever change American air combat doctrine. On August 5, 1964, 8 F-4B Phantoms took off from the USS Constellation for Operation Pierce Arrow, the fighter's first combat mission in Vietnam. Pilots expected to encounter bombers or slow fighters, perfect targets for their long-range missiles. Instead, they encountered MiG-17s flying at 200 feet altitude, blending with terrain echo, appearing and disappearing from radars like ghosts. When the Sparrows finally managed to lock onto a target, the MiGs had already closed distance and were firing 23mm cannons at less than 500 meters. At that distance, American missiles didn't have time to arm. What the manuals didn't warn about was that the Phantom's J-79 engines produced a black smoke trail visible from 40 kilometers away. Every time a pilot pushed the afterburners to escape or pursue, he painted a line in the sky that screamed his position to the enemy. Vietnamese pilots had learned to use this signature as an early warning system. When they saw the smoke, they knew exactly where to attack. Worse still, the Phantom was so heavy it needed to maintain constant speed to maneuver. Reducing power meant becoming a fixed target. On June 17, 1965, Commander Lewis Page flew a mission that revealed the most dangerous flaw in the design. His APQ-72 radar detected 2 MiG-21s at 30 miles, perfect distance for the Sparrows. He launched 4 missiles in sequence, following exactly the combat procedure. All 4 failed for the same reason. The semi-active radar required that the Phantom keep the target illuminated until impact, forcing the pilot to fly straight for 15 critical seconds. The MiGs simply broke the lock with evasive maneuvers, leaving Page defenseless and out of ammunition. He had to flee at maximum speed while enemy cannons searched for his position. By October 1965, the statistics were brutal. AIM-7 Sparrow missiles had an 8% hit rate in actual combat. The AIM-9 Sidewinders, designed to attack bombers from behind, lost the target when the agile MiGs turned sharply. And when both types of missiles failed, pilots found themselves flying a 58,000-pound interceptor in close-range dogfights against fighters that weighed half as much. It was like sending a truck to a motorcycle race. Combat reports began arriving at the Pentagon with a phrase that repeated, "We need a cannon." But the deeper problem wasn't technical, it was doctrinal. The Phantom had been designed for a fast nuclear war, where combats would last minutes and be decided with a single missile exchange. Vietnam was the opposite, a prolonged war of attrition, where pilots flew daily missions against enemies who knew every valley, every mountain, every trick to survive. The North Vietnamese had converted the Phantom's limitations into tactical advantages, and while American generals debated modifications, more pilots died, learning that the world's most advanced fighter had lethal blind spots that no one had foreseen. The smoke problem was more than just visibility, it was a death sentence. American pilots described seeing their own smoke trail stretching behind them for miles, a black arrow pointing directly at their position. Vietnamese ground observers could track Phantom formations from 50 kilometers away just by watching the sky. One pilot who survived the early years later described his experience. You'd push the throttles forward for combat power, and immediately you'd see this black plume behind you. You knew every enemy pilot in the area could see it too. You were broadcasting your position to everyone. It felt like flying with a giant target painted on your back. The weight issue compounded every other problem.
At 58,000 pounds fully loaded, the Phantom was nearly twice as heavy as a MiG-17. In a turning fight, physics worked against American pilots. The MiG could turn tighter, could reverse direction faster, could bleed less energy in maneuvers. Phantom pilots learned quickly that they couldn't dogfight with MiGs using traditional tactics. If you got into a turning fight with a MiG-17, you were going to lose. The only advantage the Phantom had was speed and power. Hit fast, hit hard, and get out. But the missile failures meant you often couldn't hit at all. The missile problem was particularly frustrating because it wasn't just one issue, it was multiple failures cascading together. The AIM-7 Sparrow was a complex weapon that required everything to work perfectly. The radar had to lock the target. The target had to stay locked during the missile's flight time. The missile itself had to track correctly and detonate at the right moment. In the laboratory and on test ranges, where conditions were controlled and targets were cooperative, the Sparrow worked reasonably well. In combat, where targets maneuvered violently, where electronic countermeasures jammed radars, where weather and terrain created interference, the Sparrow failed constantly. Pilots would lock a target, launch, and watch the missile fly off in the wrong direction. Or the missile would track correctly but failed to detonate. Or the target would break the radar lock and the missile would lose guidance. Each failure meant wasted ammunition, wasted opportunity, and often death for the pilot who had just revealed his position by launching. The casualty statistics from late 1964 through 1966 tell a story that American military planners didn't want to acknowledge. The F-4 Phantom, which was supposed to dominate the skies over Vietnam, was dying at an alarming rate. Between August 1964 and December 1966, 475 F-4 Phantoms were lost in Southeast Asia. Of those, 107 were confirmed shot down in air-to-air combat. Another 268 were lost to ground fire, surface-to-air missiles, and operational accidents. The remaining 100 were lost to causes that were never fully determined, likely a combination of mechanical failures and enemy action. Think about those numbers for a moment. In just over 2 years, nearly 500 of America's most advanced fighters were destroyed. Each Phantom carried a crew of 2, a pilot and a weapons systems officer. That's nearly 1,000 trained aircrew killed, captured, or missing. But the raw numbers don't tell the full story. The kill ratio, the measure of enemy aircraft destroyed versus friendly aircraft lost, was disastrous. In 1965, the ratio was roughly 2-to-1 in favor of the Americans. That sounds acceptable until you realize that the United States was supposed to have overwhelming technological superiority. The North Vietnamese were flying fighters that were, on paper, inferior in every measurable way. The MiG-17 was a Korean War-era design. The MiG-19 was only marginally more capable. Even the newer MiG-21, which was more comparable to the Phantom in performance, lacked the sophisticated radar and missiles that American fighters carried. Yet these supposedly inferior aircraft were achieving kill ratios that approached parity. In some months during 1966, the North Vietnamese actually shot down more American aircraft than they lost. This was supposed to be impossible.
The problem, as combat reports made clear, was that the Phantom's advantages didn't matter in the type of combat actually being fought. Long-range missiles were useless when the rules of engagement required visual identification before firing. Sophisticated radar was worthless when MiGs flew at treetop level, where ground clutter made them invisible. The rules of engagement were particularly frustrating for American pilots. Due to concerns about accidentally shooting down friendly aircraft or civilian airliners, pilots were required to visually identify targets before engaging. This meant closing to within a few kilometers, exactly the range where the Phantom's advantages disappeared and its disadvantages became fatal. One pilot described the absurdity.
We'd detect a target on radar at 40 miles. Perfect setup for a Sparrow shot, but we couldn't fire. We had to close in, visually confirm it was actually an enemy fighter, and by that time, we were in his weapons range and he was maneuvering hard. The whole point of beyond visual range missiles was negated by the rules we had to follow. The North Vietnamese exploited these rules ruthlessly. Their ground controllers would vector MiGs toward American formations, knowing that the Americans couldn't fire until they achieved visual identification. The MiGs would wait until the Americans were close, then engage in close-range combat where they had the advantage. The training gap also contributed to the casualties. American pilots in the early years of the war had been trained primarily for nuclear strike missions and long-range interception. Close-range dogfighting, the kind that characterized most Vietnam air combat, had been de-emphasized in training. Many pilots arrived in Vietnam having never practiced air combat maneuvering against dissimilar aircraft. They had trained against other American fighters using similar tactics. When they encountered North Vietnamese pilots who had been trained by Soviet instructors in completely different tactics, they were at a significant disadvantage. The North Vietnamese also had a huge advantage in that they were fighting over their own territory. A Vietnamese pilot who was hit or running low on fuel could simply land at any of several nearby airfields. An American pilot in the same situation had to either nurse his damaged aircraft hundreds of miles back to a carrier or Thailand, or eject over enemy territory and face capture. This geographic advantage meant that North Vietnamese pilots could take more risks. They could commit fully to combat, knowing they had friendly territory nearby. American pilots always had to keep enough fuel to get home, which limited how long they could stay in a fight. The surface-to-air missile threat added another lethal dimension. The Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline was a formidable weapon that could reach altitudes where the Phantom operated. American pilots had to constantly watch for SAM launches while also dealing with enemy fighters and ground fire. The combination of threats created what pilots called a high-threat environment, where you were never safe. At high altitude, you were vulnerable to SAMs. At medium altitude, you were in range of heavy anti-aircraft artillery. At low altitude, you were vulnerable to small arms fire and visually guided missiles. And at any altitude, MiGs might appear without warning. The stress on pilots was immense. They were flying daily missions into heavily defended airspace, in aircraft that had proven vulnerable, with weapons that often didn't work, under rules of engagement that negated their advantages. The psychological toll was as significant as the physical danger. One F-4 pilot later wrote about the experience, "Every time you launched on a mission, you knew there was a real chance you wouldn't come back. You'd see the empty spots in the squadron where guys had been shot down. You'd go to the intelligence briefing and see the updates on SAM sites and MiG bases. And you'd climb into that cockpit knowing that you were going into a place where a lot of people wanted to kill you and had the tools to do it." The mechanical reliability of early Phantoms also contributed to losses. The J-79 engines, while powerful, were complex and required meticulous maintenance. In the harsh conditions of Southeast Asia, with high temperatures, high humidity, and limited maintenance facilities, engine problems were common. Compressor stalls, where the engine would suddenly lose power or shut down completely, were a particular concern. This could happen during high-G maneuvers in combat, exactly when you needed maximum power. Pilots reported multiple incidents of losing an engine during combat and having to fight their way out on a single engine or eject over enemy territory. The hydraulic systems were also problematic. The Phantom's flight controls were entirely hydraulic with no manual backup. A single hydraulic failure could make the aircraft uncontrollable. Battle damage that severed hydraulic lines would result in immediate loss of the aircraft. By early 1967, the situation had become a crisis. The Phantom was losing aircraft at a rate that couldn't be sustained. Morale among F-4 squadrons was declining. Pilots were requesting transfers to other aircraft, and the Navy and Air Force brass were facing hard questions about whether the Phantom program had been a catastrophic mistake. Something had to change, and change was coming, though it would take years and cost hundreds more lives before the Phantom finally became the weapon it was supposed to be.
In February 1967, the first Phantom rolled off the McDonnell production line with something previous models never had, an M61 Vulcan 6-barrel cannon mounted in the nose. The F-4E model had finally addressed the most glaring deficiency in the design. The integration process had been an engineering nightmare. Inserting 640 rounds of 20mm ammunition into an already packed fuselage required redesigning 47 structural components. But the real challenge was the recoil. Each time the cannon fired its 6,000 rounds per minute, it generated 5,000 pounds of force that shook the entire aircraft. Early test pilots reported that when firing, the aircraft vibrated so badly it was impossible to maintain aim for more than 2 seconds. Engineers had to develop a complex mounting system with dampeners and reinforcements to make the cannon usable in combat. Simultaneously, engineers attacked the black smoke problem. The solution came from the Smokeless Eagle program. Water methanol injectors that reduced combustion temperature by 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The new J79 GE17 engines eliminated 90% of the visible trail, but at a cost. The system added 800 pounds of weight and reduced combat range by 80 nautical miles. Pilots accepted the trade-off immediately. As Colonel James Castler said after his first mission in a modified F-4E, "I'd rather go 80 miles less far than be seen from 40 miles away." But technical modifications were only half the equation. The real transformation came from recognizing that the problem wasn't just the aircraft, it was how pilots were trained to use it. In March 1969, the Navy established the Top Gun program at Miramar Naval Air Station in California. Unlike conventional training that focused on long-range interceptions, Top Gun taught dogfighting using actual enemy fighter tactics. T-38s painted as MiG-17s and modified F-5s simulating MiG-21s. The instructors, all combat veterans, had one brutal rule. Students had to achieve an 85% hit rate in simulated combat before graduating. The average class lost 60% of its members in the first 2 weeks. Those who remained learned lessons that couldn't be found in any manual. They learned that the Phantom, despite its weight, could be competitive in dogfights if flown correctly. The key was energy management, using the Phantom's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to control the vertical dimension of combat. While MiGs could turn tighter in the horizontal plane, the Phantom could climb and dive faster. Top Gun graduates learned to fight in the vertical, using high yo-yo and low yo-yo maneuvers that exploited the Phantom's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. They learned to work as teams, with 2 ship elements supporting each other rather than operating independently. And critically, they learned when to disengage, when to recognize that a fight was unwinnable and escape to fight another day. The results were immediate and dramatic. In January 1970, Lieutenant Randy Cunningham became one of the first pilots to shoot down a MiG-21 with the new M61 cannon, using a technique learned at Top Gun. Faint retreat, sudden vertical turn, and a 2-second burst at 800 meters distance. 6 months later, combat statistics had reversed. The improved Sparrow missile hit rate climbed to 34%.
The Sidewinder, with new all-aspect capability, reached 40%. And for the first time since 1964, Phantoms began accumulating more victories than losses. The Air Force developed its own equivalent program, eventually called Red Flag, at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The concept was similar: realistic combat training against adversary aircraft using enemy tactics. Both services recognized that the technological solution alone wasn't enough. Pilots needed to be trained for the war they were actually fighting, not the war planners had imagined. The improvement in tactics and training, combined with the technical modifications, created a fundamentally different aircraft. The F-4E, with its cannon, smokeless engines, and Top Gun-trained crews, was no longer trying to be a long-range interceptor forced into dogfighting. It had become a genuine multi-role fighter, optimized for the combat environment it actually operated in. But the transformation had come at a terrible cost. Between 1964 and 1969, when the new tactics and aircraft variants finally began to dominate, hundreds of pilots and weapons systems officers had died learning lessons that should have been obvious from the beginning. One lesson was that technology alone doesn't win wars. The Phantom had been designed with the assumption that advanced missiles and radar would make dogfighting obsolete. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Close-range combat remained a critical skill, and aircraft needed to be designed with that reality in mind. Another lesson was that rules of engagement matter as much as technical capability. The requirement for visual identification before firing negated the Phantom's most significant advantage. Future aircraft and weapons would need to be designed with realistic rules of engagement in mind, not idealized scenarios that assumed unrestricted combat. Perhaps the most important lesson was about adaptability. The Phantom succeeded ultimately not because it was perfect, but because it could be modified, improved, and evolved to meet actual combat conditions. Aircraft that couldn't adapt, like the F-104 Starfighter, were quickly retired as obsolete. The organizational culture also changed. The Top Gun program represented a fundamental shift in how the military thought about training. Instead of theoretical instruction based on doctrine, training became experiential, based on actual combat conditions and tactics. This philosophy would influence military training for decades to come. By 1972, the F-4 Phantom had been completely transformed. The aircraft that had arrived in Vietnam as a failure was now producing all of the American aces of the war. Pilots who had once dreaded flying it now praised it as a capable fighting machine when properly employed. The kill ratio had dramatically improved. In 1972, the last year of significant air combat over North Vietnam, the ratio was approximately 3-to-1 in favor of American forces.